Part 4 shows accessing the left-hand cylinder head, then steps for using the factory tools to check and adjust cam timing. After an explanation of torque wrench adapter use, I'll demo how to check valve clearance as well. Okay, now I need to start on the engine, the basic engine work. Primarily we're going to be checking the valve timing and the valve clearance. So you need to remove the spark plug cover and the cover for the fuel injection. This cover pulls off from the front and has an indexing tab here in the back to locate where it goes. Now we need to remove the clip for the firing trigger and pull the wire out of the coil, the stick coil. It has a keeper up here. You don't need to remove that keeper. The screw that holds it into the cylinder head, just leave it out of the way. And then even though these are real thin bolts on the inside, they're only 5mm bolts on the thickness of the bolt. It takes a T50 socket on the top to remove these. They're not on tight at all. It's 10 Newton meters to put these back on here. So those need to be loosened up. There's a special tool for pulling the stick coil. So this is a multi-tool. It has a tool for some motorcycles to remove the quick release axles. And this is the coil puller on the top. This slides right onto the end of the stick coil, into the grooves that are on the stick coil. And then you put some kind of a screwdriver or a tip through here, and you pull out evenly. And as you pull it out, you can see there's one indexing pin on the rubber of the seal for the stick coil, and it can only be installed in one place when it comes back in. The notch on the other side cylinder is on the bottom, so the stick coils are interchangeable from left to right, but they're indexed so that it always makes the lead go forward. So now we can remove all the rest of the engagement of the threads. If you park your motorcycle on a side stand, when you shut it off and you park it on the side stand, before you come to do this service, there may be as much as 3/4 of a cup of fluid down here in the cylinder head. We've parked the bike on the center stand so that both cylinder heads will drain evenly. So we'll see how much fluid comes out. Okay, so now to remove this, it's been on here for a long time and it takes a little bit of a jar to get the cylinder head broke loose from the gasket. Have a drain pan underneath it so you can catch the oil that comes out. So there's some oil draining out of here. You can see how much oil is still inside the cylinder head cover. Not very much, but once you take the the cylinder head cover off, there's one more gasket that keeps the oil from going into the stick coil area. So I just hang this on here. If we have to remove the block, the bearing block for the cams themselves, there's one more O-ring inside here. So of all of the oil sealing to keep oil from getting into the spark plug area, you need to make sure that there's an O-ring on the inside if you remove the bearing block, and the standard gasket that goes, it matches the big cylinder head cover. Now we'll pull out the spark plug. Takes a 14mm socket, deep well socket. This is not on very tight at all. It's only on with 12 Newton meters, so it may feel extremely light torque to remove the spark plug. This bike is notorious for erosion of the spark plugs. So you need to check the gap very closely to make sure that the center electrode hasn't turned oval from eroding. The ground electrodes don't show very much wear, but the center electrode wears down and gets very narrow so that the gap increases, and it puts a lot of load on the ignition system, and you can burn up a stick coil by having too wide of a gap to make it jump every time. You look at the insulator tip for the correct color. This is a nice white creamy color. You look for deposits on the ground electrodes to see if you're running bad fuel or if you have a poor fuel filter that's causing fuel to be contaminated as it comes in. So examination of the spark plug gives you a lot of indications of the health of the overall engine. While we're looking at the side of the cams, I understand this is a method of compression release so that at low RPMs when the engine is cranking, this one actually holds one of the exhaust valves open slightly so it reduces the cranking effort for the starter motor while the engine is starting. As soon as it gets to a certain RPM, this flings out and no longer applies any compression release to the starting cycle. All right, what we're going to do here, what we need to achieve is I'm going to remove the access plug to get to the flywheel. There's a notch on the flywheel that we'll use the indexing tool. It has an A position and a B end. We're only going to use the A end to do top dead center. I've heard that the B end is for bottom dead center for some other purpose of timing the counterbalance shafts or something else, but we only use the A side. And when we index the wheel, there is two indexing marks. There are two indexing marks. One is for top dead center on this cylinder, and the other indexing mark on the flywheel is for the other cylinder. So in order to make sure that you get it into the right position, we're going to use, this is the tool that's going to line up on the flats of the cam when they're exactly lined up, but there is a laser etched barcode on the end of each cam, and those point away from each other when it's in the correct position for top dead center on this cylinder. So in order to get the cams in the correct position, you cock the indexing tool that has a little bit of a ledge that you bring the spring-loaded plunger back and you hang it on there. You set it in the hole that has access to the flywheel. You just screw it all the way in until it bottoms against the edge of the crankcase. Put the gearbox all the way in 6th gear. The service manual shows a special tool that engages into the holes on the side of the gear for the cam chain timing that you can wheel over the engine and position the engine correctly. I don't have that tool, so I just crank it over by hand, and what I'm looking for is the approximate position of the laser etched marks. Right now they're pointing right at each other, and if you look at the cam lobes, they're depressing the intake valves right now. The exhaust valves are in overlap. They're not doing anything, but it's just easy to bump the engine over with one hand. The spark plug is removed on this side, so that's enough of a release of the compression. The other spark plug is still in, but it's not stopping me from rotating it. It's getting close to being at the top, and so now you can see this cam lobe is pointed completely away from the follower. This one is pointed away from the follower, and so I'm getting real close to the position. So now I'm going to take the pin from A position and let it drop into to ride on the flywheel, and it will drop into the indent on the flywheel when it's actually at its correct position for top dead center. And you can hear it drop into position, and the cylinders are all timed at top dead center. The cam valve train is all in the correct position. Now, the engine hasn't run in a while. The oil pressure has bled down. So the cam chain tensioner is on the bottom. I haven't removed it. Nothing has been changed. It's from the standard position. Okay, so now that the indexing pin is in correctly, the engine is at top dead center. I'm going to remove the cam chain tensioner and install the tool to preload the cam chain properly. This has a little bit of oil that comes out with it. So now we install the special tool, the other part of the tool. This comes in two parts. There's the sleeve and the pre-tensioner. So it just goes right in exactly where the normal cam tensioner was. You thread it in until it comes to a stop on the casting, and then there's a special tool that's used to tension the spring, and you just turn in the inner spring. This is applying pressure to the back side of the cam chain, and you just tighten it. It clicks 3 times. You click it, make it click. Now we see if the cam is in time. We put on the special tool to index the cam lobes, and this should fit onto both lobes simultaneously. It doesn't quite fit. It's not quite in time. The amount of out of time is very minute, but they don't fit. It doesn't show that it's correctly in time. There's no way to force this on. You can't rotate the cams to make it fit. It's a go or no-go gauge. It works or it doesn't work. So this one shows that it's not in time. So in order to get the indexing tool to fit properly, it didn't fit. Now we need to actually loosen the nuts that go on the end of the camshafts to time the cams. So this is the timing trigger, and it goes across the electronic pickup that's at the bottom of the cylinder, and we need to remove it to get access to the bolt that goes on the end of the camshafts. So this has to be rotated. So once it's out, you have access to both ends of the cam nuts. Now it's time to remove the tension on the bolts up here. They're 16 millimeter bolts that go through the gear to the camshaft itself. They ride off the center drive gear for the cam. These are torqued on to 56 Newton meters, so they're on very tight. I have a tool that I use that is the crow's foot box end, so that I have no chance of rounding over the edges. There are a lot of crow's foot adapters that are, this is used for the torque wrench to tighten them properly, but if you use an open end, you have a chance of, with an inferior tool, you can splay the crow's foot open and you'll round over an edge and not have the right torque. So I'm just going to loosen these up. Both of these need to be loosened. I don't know exactly which one of those cams is out of time, but these are both now loose, and the cams are free to move. They're independent of each other and of all the gearing for this timing. So now we put this timing indexer on here and get both cams on. They fit on. This fits on perfectly smooth and easily right now. We leave this indexing tool on here, put the crow's foot back on the torque wrench at this point. Using a torque wrench, you have to understand the mechanics of a torque wrench. If you put the torque wrench and have the crow's foot or the adapter extension protruding out from the calculated distance from the center of pivot to the indexing mark on the handle, this is how all torque is calculated. So if you have it beyond here, you have to use a formula to calculate. In this case, you'd have a reduced number because you have more advantage. If this was all the way around and to the inside, you would have to use a larger number to achieve the same amount of torque. If you put your torque wrench straight out at a 90-degree angle, the torque number red is the torque number achieved because it's at the same specific distance that was used to calculate torque from the device in the first place. So this is supposed to be at 56 Newton meters. To tighten these up, the indexer, the tool, the timing tool is on properly. Now that the cams are timed and the nuts have been torqued, it's time to reinstall the complete timing indexer for the whole engine. There's one notch on the side of this, right, marked in the side, and it needs to be lined up with the induction pickup that comes through the cylinder. There are two little notches that are in the side of this induction pickup. The reference that you're going to use is the notch that's facing aft on the bike and the lower edge of the notch. So now I need to put this in, and once again it's this fiddly bit to get it in, get it on the shaft first, and then you have to rotate it around until you get the timing mark lined up, and you can see that the timing mark goes to the lower edge. Okay, so once you get the indexing mark lined up with the bottom of the edge of the notch on the induction pickup, you torque this to 6 Newton meters. It's a very small amount, but it does need to be tightened properly or it will slip on the end of the cam. There's no indexing, there's no teeth. It's simply a pinch fit on here. And once again, check to make sure that the timing is still correct. The indexing mark on the timing trigger matches the pickup on the side. Now that we're done with the timing on the cams, it's time to check the clearance. The engine is still at perfect top dead center for both the intake valves to be checked, and we need to remove the twist protection rubber pad on the bottom so we have access to the lower cams. This rubber pad is just held on with these two little teeth that hold onto the bottom edge of the casting where the cylinder head cover is removed. Now that the camshafts are in time, or if you haven't had to change the timing up to this point and it's just going to be a valve clearance check, all you have to do is make sure that the cams are in the correct position. The base circle is on the followers. So if you don't have an indexing tool to put the flywheel in the correct position, you can locate where the camshafts are supposed to go with just using a straight edge, a machinist straight edge. There's laser etched marks on the end of the camshafts. It's real easy to line up these marks. You just put the transmission in gear and you bump it over until you get them lined up. The intake camshaft has the mark on the top, the exhaust camshaft has the mark on the bottom, and you know this way that the cam's base lobe is riding against the follower and it's in the correct position so that you can get the clearance for all the valves on that side of the engine. Now that the cams are at top dead center, you should use a valve clearance worksheet. I made this simple worksheet with the original clearance column, original shim thickness column, a new clearance column, and a new shim column. It also shows the intake and exhaust tolerance as well as the midpoint target for what you're trying to achieve. There's a bottom half of this spreadsheet that matches the top one so you can use this on a subsequent service. What you do is you measure the clearance, and if you find it's outside of the range, you need to remove the block that holds the camshafts in. And once you get the camshafts out, you measure your actual thickness of your shim, and this is where you have to either purchase new shims from the dealer or buy a whole kit that contains 50 or 60 of the shims, and you have plenty to work with throughout the life of your bike. And I'll demonstrate that whole process on the right-hand cylinder later. I use metric feeler gauges. I find that they're at a 0.02 millimeter thickness. If you use the standard SAE gauges, they're marked in thousandths of an inch that happen to have the equivalent of a metric marking on them. They're just too far apart and don't serve my purposes very well. I get a lot better readings by using the metric gauges. Here we're starting with a feeler gauge that is near the largest clearance specified for the intake cams. As you can see, it's logical to slide the feeler gauge blade in from the top, between the lobe and the follower. The caution here is to not slide the blade in from the side and also not to make the clearance check between the back of the follower and the shim on the end of the valve spring seat itself. It's a possibility to incorrectly check from the sides of the intake cams and almost impossible to do it wrong from the exhaust cams. Here I have a feeler gauge blade that slides into the space between the lobe and the follower with a little resistance. If you hold the blade too far away from the point of friction, the blade can bend here on the thinner blades used on the intake cams. The goal here is to get a feeling for the difference between a bind and simply sliding on two oily surfaces. Holding the blade closer to the friction point gives better control of the blade and better tactile feel for the correct drag that represents a valid value of the clearance you're trying to record. It's the same technique on the exhaust cams. Sometimes it's a little more difficult to align the feeler gauge blade properly to achieve a slide versus a bind on the blade. It helps to induce a slight bend or arch in the blade so it follows the curves between the cam lobe and the follower face. There's also less tendency for these thicker blades to bend from pushing them up into the clearance point. Now that you've recorded all of the left-hand valve clearances on the worksheet, you can see here that they all fall within the tolerances as specified, and no shim replacements are required on this side of the engine. Now it's time to back off the spring tension on the cam tensioner tool. It takes about 3 or 4 complete revolutions to be slackened and easy to turn. Then just unscrew the body of the tool from the cylinder head. Before replacing the crush washer on the cam tensioner to complete the cam service on this side, I'm showing how much rotational difference there is and why it's essential to use this tool for cam timing. Reinstall the cam tensioner with a new 20x24mm copper crush washer. You shouldn't use the same size 20x24mm aluminum crush washer that goes on the crankcase drain plug. It takes a little effort to compress the plunger spring inside before the threads engage. The torque setting for this is 30 Newton meters. To complete reassembly of the left-hand side, you need to replace the twist protection pad, the spark plug tunnel seal, the head cover with seal, torqued to 10 Newton meters, the spark plug, torqued to 12 Newton meters on dry threads, the stick coil, the ignition trigger wire, the fuel injection cover, and the coil cover. The last thing you do is unlock the flywheel indexing pin so you can work on the other side.